"Mom, your stepfather is here at the facility. He has bolt cutters." I didn't know it yet, but something had already been set in motion. My face went hot. The words hung there like something I couldn't push away. I reached into the drawer and touched the key, the real one. Eli's voice came through steady but tight. This wasn't theoretical anymore. It was happening at a staffed facility with witnesses, and the manager was standing right there watching a man with bolt cutters insist he had a right to something that wasn't his. I closed my eyes for a second. I whispered a short prayer for steadiness. Then I went quiet and just listened. I could picture it even though I wasn't there. Landon standing at the unit, bolt cutters in hand, convinced the contents belonged to him now. I didn't raise my voice. I told Eli to follow the plan. Call security, notify the local police, document everything. Then I said the part that mattered most. The lock was never the point. I wish I could say it began there, but it started weeks earlier. Maybe the day my dad sat me down, or the day I realized what Landon was counting. I never told my mom what was actually inside the unit. She thought it was old furniture. Tax papers. The kind of things you keep in storage because you're supposed to, not because they matter. Things that represent a life but don't define it. When she'd bring it up, always casual and light, suggesting we clean it out together someday, make a weekend of it, maybe donate what we didn't need, I'd deflect. I'd say something about needing leave, about finding the right weekend, about how it wasn't urgent. The unit had been paid ahead. It wasn't costing anyone anything. There was time. And she'd let it drop because it seemed reasonable, because I sounded reasonable, because she trusted that when I said I'd handle it, I meant it. I was still in my scrubs from the shift, still at my desk on base when Eli called that Wednesday. The words had hung there like something physical I couldn't push away, like something I'd have to reach through to get to whatever came next. Not the spare most people would think mattered. My fingers had found it automatically, the metal cool and familiar, and for a second I just held it there, grounding myself in the one piece of this that was still under my control. He was doing exactly what we'd planned, but I could hear the edge underneath, the way his words clipped short at the ends. The slight pause before he said, "Stepfather," like he was choosing the word carefully. Every detail, every movement, every word Landon had used when he'd shown up. The one that made him look reasonable. Convinced the lock was the only thing standing between him and whatever he thought was waiting inside. Convinced, maybe, that I wouldn't find out until it was too late. I kept it level and clear. I told him to follow the plan we'd discussed weeks ago. Get statements if he could. Get video if the cameras caught it. Do not let Landon touch the unit. Do not let him claim this was a misunderstanding, the part I needed Eli to understand completely. The moment that made it all real, the moment I understood what my dad had been anticipating, was that Wednesday afternoon when Eli called and said someone was trying to cut their way into a unit I'd never explained to anyone, not even my mom. My dad was the kind of man who kept backups of backups. He labeled things. He had a system for everything, files organized by year and category, receipts and envelopes, important documents in a fireproof box in his office. When he got sick, really sick, the kind where you know how it ends, even when no one says it out loud, he didn't leave chaos behind. He left instructions. He left a plan. He left me the tools to protect my mom from something he couldn't name but knew might come. After he died, I met with the lawyer alone, just me. He handed me a sealed envelope, a key, and a look that said he didn't know what was inside, but he knew it mattered. The instructions were clear and simple. Don't rush, don't explain unless you have to, keep it private. Let the right moment arrive instead of forcing it. I read them 3 times before I understood what my dad was really saying. He wasn't telling me to hide something. He was telling me to protect it until the people who needed to see it were ready to see it, without defenses, without excuses, without someone standing between them and the truth. The unit itself was unremarkable. 10 by 10, climate controlled, downtown in a facility that looked like every other storage place you've driven past and never thought about. Metal door, concrete floor, fluorescent light overhead. Nothing about it suggested what it was really for. Nothing about it looked like a trap waiting to spring. When my mom asked about it the first time, I could hear her trying to be helpful. She said it was probably time to go through Dad's things, that holding on to old furniture wasn't doing anyone any good, that we could make a day of it, maybe get lunch after, maybe turn it into something that felt less heavy. I told her I'd handle it when I had leave. She accepted that. She didn't push, not then. She was still in the early grief, the kind where you're just trying to get through the day, and the storage unit felt like one more thing that could wait. She met Landon about a year after Dad passed, long enough that the sharp edges of grief had softened into something duller and more constant, long enough that she'd stopped expecting to turn around and find him there, long enough that loneliness had started to feel like the default instead of the exception. He was charming in the way that works on people who are lonely and don't want to examine why something feels easy. He said the right things about my service, thanked me for it in that way that sounds respectful if you don't listen too closely, if you don't notice that the thanks always comes with a little edge, a little implication that you've chosen something that takes you away from the people who need you. Helped my mom with things around the house, fixed the porch light that had been flickering for months, mowed the lawn, showed up when she called, made himself useful in ways that felt like kindness until you stepped back and saw the pattern. I attended the wedding remotely from base. I watched on a screen, the connection stuttering once or twice, the audio cutting out during the vows. I watched my mom in a dress I'd never seen before, smiling in a way that looked real, and I sent a message afterward that said I was happy for her. And I was, or I wanted to be, or I wanted to want to be. But then he started asking questions. First, it was about the will. Casual. Just making sure everything was in order. Making sure my mom knew where things were if she needed them. Then the accounts. Had she updated the beneficiaries? Did she need help consolidating anything? Was there anything he should know about in case of emergency? Then the storage unit. He framed it as concern. He said it seemed strange that I was managing something from across the country when he was right there and could handle it. He said it wasn't fair to make my mom worry about one more thing when she already had enough on her plate. He said he just wanted to help. He said it over and over until the repetition itself started to feel like evidence. I stayed polite. I stayed vague. I didn't confront him, and I didn't warn my mom because I didn't have anything concrete yet. Just a feeling, just the sense that he was counting things that didn't belong to him, adding them up in his head, planning for outcomes that hadn't been offered. So I called the storage facility. Eli managed the place. He'd known my dad not well, but enough to remember him as the guy who paid 6 months ahead and never caused problems, the kind of tenant who made his job easier instead of harder. I explained the situation carefully. I kept it factual. I said I needed the unit restricted to me only, no exceptions. No matter who called, no matter what story they told, no matter if someone showed up claiming to be family or saying they had permission or insisting there'd been a misunderstanding. Eli didn't ask why. He just said he'd flag it in the system and make sure the whole staff knew. He said he'd put a note on the account that required him to verify any access request directly with me before anyone got close to the unit. He said he'd handled situations like this before, people going through divorces, people with family members who couldn't let go, people trying to protect something from someone who thought they had a claim. I added a second lock, something heavy and visible that made it clear this wasn't casual storage. This was intentional. I started keeping a log, dates, phrases, messages, anything that felt like it might matter later. Anything that could establish a pattern if I needed one. I wrote down when Landon asked questions and what words he used, when my mom repeated his concerns and how her tone shifted when she did, when the questions stopped sounding curious and started sounding entitled. And I installed something else, something invisible unless you knew where to look. I'm not going to explain what it was because the details aren't mine to share and because knowing wouldn't change anything for you. But it was there, watching, recording, waiting for someone to make a move they thought no one would see. My mom called a few days later and mentioned Landon had offered to check the unit for her. She said it casual, like she was passing along helpful information, like it was something I should be grateful for. He'd said it would save me a trip. He'd said he was local and it made sense for him to handle it. He'd said he didn't mind. I told her no. Not harsh, not angry, just no. She asked why. I could hear the confusion in her voice, the first hint of something sharper underneath. I said Dad had asked me to manage it and I was managing it. I said it wasn't about convenience. It was about keeping a promise. She didn't argue, not directly, but I could hear the shift. The way the conversation ended, a little faster than it would have before. The way she said she understood even though her tone said she didn't. The next time we talked, Landon's tone had changed too. He wasn't asking anymore. He was framing. He told my mom I was being secretive, that I didn't trust him, that my time in the military had made me rigid and suspicious and unable to see when someone was genuinely trying to help. And she repeated it to me, not as an accusation exactly, but as a concern, like maybe he had a point, like maybe I should think about why I was making this so difficult. I didn't fight it. I just wrote it down, date, time, exact wording, added it to the log, watched the pattern build. The Wednesday the call came, I was finishing a shift. I'd been on base all day, paperwork and routine care, nothing urgent. The kind of day that feels productive but unremarkable. I was about to head out, had my bag packed and was checking my phone for messages when it rang and Eli's name came up. I knew immediately something was wrong. Eli never called unless there was a problem, and the problems were usually small. Someone's lock jammed, someone forgot their access code, someone needed help moving a couch. This didn't feel small. He was tense. Professional, but tense. I could hear it in the way he said my name, in the pause before he explained. He said Landon was at the facility claiming the unit belonged to his wife and he had bolt cutters. He said Landon had shown up about 20 minutes ago, calm and confident, acting like this was routine, like he had every right to be there, like the lock was just an inconvenience that needed solving. I told him to follow the plan, the one we'd discussed weeks ago, in case something exactly like this happened. Call security, notify the local police, document everything, get statements if anyone else witnessed it, get video if the cameras caught it. Do not let him touch the unit. Do not let him claim this was a misunderstanding or a family matter or anything that would let him walk away without consequences. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out the key. The real one, not the one most people would assume mattered, but the one my dad had labeled and sealed in an envelope with instructions I'd read 3 times before I understood what he was telling me. I held it for a second, feeling the weight of it, the responsibility of it. I made myself slow down. I forced myself to be precise. James chapter 1 verse 19. I wasn't going to react from heat. I wasn't going to let emotion drive my decisions. I wasn't going to give anyone a reason to call this impulsive or vindictive or anything other than what it was. Planned, documented, defensible. I didn't rush home. I didn't call my mom. I didn't do anything that would look like panic. I treated panic like the enemy of claim proof. Because panic makes you sloppy. Panic makes you say things you can't take back. Panic gives the other person ammunition, and I needed this to be airtight because my dad had built the unit for exactly this, for the moment when someone would try to force their way into something that wasn't theirs and claim it was justified. I remembered the conversation we had on the back porch, late in his illness, when he was still clear enough to plan, when the painkillers hadn't blurred his thinking yet, but the weight loss had made him look smaller than I'd ever seen him. We sat in lawn chairs with the evening settling in around us, and he told me what he was worried about. He said he wasn't worried about me. He knew I could handle myself. He knew the service had taught me how to think through problems, how to stay calm under pressure, how to document and plan and execute. He was worried about what would happen after, when grief made people easy to manipulate, when someone kind and helpful could show up and start rewriting the story, when loneliness could make my mom vulnerable to someone who saw opportunity instead of partnership. He said the unit wasn't about hiding things, it was about clarity, about making sure the truth couldn't be twisted or reinterpreted or claimed by someone who hadn't earned the right, about giving me the tools to protect my mom without having to convince her of something she wasn't ready to see. He said sometimes the best protection is invisible until it's needed. He asked me if I understood. I said I did, and I meant it even though I didn't fully understand yet, even though I couldn't picture the exact scenario he was preparing for. I trusted him. I trusted that he'd thought this through. I trusted that if he was building something this careful, it was because he'd seen enough of the world to know how it could go wrong. The lawyer gave me the envelope the day after the funeral. I was alone in his office, numb and trying to focus on words that kept sliding past me without landing. The room smelled like old paper and coffee. There was a faint hum from the air conditioning. Everything felt muted and distant, like I was watching it happen to someone else. He handed me the key and a set of written instructions that my dad had sealed himself. The envelope had my name on it in Dad's handwriting, careful and deliberate. The lawyer said he didn't know what was inside. He said my dad had been very specific about privacy. He said if I had questions later, I could call, but for now, this was between me and the instructions. I opened it in my car. I sat in the parking lot and read through the pages twice before the logic settled. The logic was simple but precise. Don't involve my mom unless it became necessary. Log any questions or pressure about the unit. If someone tried to access it without my permission, let them. Don't stop them before they move. Let them reveal themselves through action instead of trying to prove intent. That's what the invisible safeguard was for. That's why the lock didn't matter. The lock was just a visible barrier. The real barrier was documentation, pattern, proof that couldn't be talked away or reframed as misunderstanding. I didn't tell my mom about the attempted break-in right away. I wanted to. I wanted to call her and explain what Landon had just tried and what it meant, but I knew how it would sound. I knew she'd hear it as me attacking her husband, as me being paranoid or controlling or unable to let her move on. She called me first. She said Landon was upset. She said he felt excluded, like I didn't trust him, like I was treating him as an outsider in his own marriage. She asked what I was so worried about. I asked her what Landon said I was upset about. She paused. Then she repeated his line. He worries about you. He worries about me. He just wants to help. I told her worry doesn't create ownership. I told her. Dad asked me to handle the unit, and I was handling it exactly the way he'd instructed. She said I'd changed since joining the service, that I used to be warmer, that I used to trust people. I wrote down the date and time. I wrote down the exact phrasing. Then I put the phone down and stared at the log. Over the next 2 weeks, things shifted. Subtly at first, then more obviously. My mom stopped answering my calls as quickly. It would take hours instead of minutes, sometimes a full day. When we did talk, she sounded tired, distracted, like she was listening but also doing something else, like the conversation was one more task on a list that was getting longer. She mentioned Landon had started managing the bills because it was easier, because she'd let one slip and the late fee had bothered her, because he'd offered, and it seemed simpler than trying to keep track herself. He'd added himself to her bank account for convenience, so he could deposit checks if she was busy, so he could handle groceries or utilities without having to ask for money. She said it was helpful. She said it took pressure off. He'd taken over the grocery shopping because she'd been forgetting things, coming home without milk or bread, standing in the kitchen trying to remember what she'd meant to buy. She said it was just easier to let him handle it, that he was good at planning meals, that he liked having a project. She framed it all as help, as him stepping up because she was overwhelmed. And maybe she was. Grief does that. It scatters you. It makes simple things feel impossible. But the pattern was clear to me even if it wasn't to her. He wasn't helping, he was replacing. He was making himself essential so that removing him would feel like tearing out a support beam. I started texting more, short check-ins. Nothing that required a long response. Just enough to keep a line open, just enough to make sure she knew I was still here. That I hadn't gone anywhere, that she could still reach me if she needed to. One night she called late, after 10. I was already in bed, but I answered on the first ring. She was crying. Not loud, just that quiet kind of crying where you can barely hear it, but you know it's been going on for a while. She said she felt like she was losing me, that I was pulling away, that every time we talked lately it felt strained, that Landon kept saying I didn't approve of their marriage and it was making everything harder, that she was caught in the middle and she didn't know how to fix it. I told her I wasn't pulling away. I told her I loved her and I was always going to be here. I told her that distance didn't mean absence, that being on base didn't mean I'd stopped caring. But I didn't tell her what I was seeing. I didn't tell her about the log or the facility manager or the instructions my dad had left, because she wasn't ready to hear it. Because if I said it out loud before she could see it herself, it would sound like I was inventing problems, like I was trying to sabotage her happiness. And if I pushed too hard, Landon would use it to isolate her further. He'd say I was controlling. He'd say I couldn't accept her moving on. He'd make it about me instead of about him. So I waited. I kept logging. I kept checking in. I kept the unit locked down and the documentation building. And I prayed, not elaborate prayers, not formal ones, just steady reminders to stay patient. Romans chapter 12, verse 19. I wasn't supposed to force justice. I wasn't supposed to make it happen on my timeline. I was supposed to let the truth do its work in its own time. Then my mom called and said Landon wanted to talk to me. Wanted us all to talk. She sounded nervous, tentative, like she was asking for something she wasn't sure I'd give. She said he'd been asking about the unit again, about why I wouldn't share access, about what I thought was in there that was so important. She said he felt disrespected. She said he thought I was keeping secrets that affected their finances, that affected their future, that I had no right to keep from them. I asked her if she wanted to talk about it, if this was her idea or his. She said no. She said she just wanted us to work it out. She said she wanted her family to feel like family again, instead of like two sides pulling in opposite directions. I didn't argue. I told her I'd be home in 2 weeks for leave and we could all sit down then. We could talk it through. We could figure it out. She said okay. The relief in her voice was obvious, like she thought proximity would fix it. Like sitting in the same room would make me see what she saw. Like if we just talked long enough, the tension would dissolve and we'd all realize it had been a misunderstanding. I started packing. I went through the checklist I always used. Uniforms for travel, civilian clothes for home, toiletries, laptop, phone charger. I moved through it mechanically, thinking about what was coming. I texted Eli and told him I'd be in town. I told him to keep the same restrictions in place and to call me immediately if Landon showed up again. He said he would. He said he'd been watching for unusual activity and so far there'd been nothing since the bolt cutter incident. No calls, no drive-bys, no attempts to sweet-talk the staff. I told him that meant Landon was waiting for me to arrive, that he was betting I'd be more reasonable in person, that he probably spent the last 2 weeks building his case to my mom so she'd be on his side when the conversation happened. I flew in on a Saturday morning. My mom picked me up at the airport, and the drive back was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. She kept glancing at me like she was trying to read whether I was angry or just tired, whether I was bracing for a fight or open to compromise. I told her I was glad to see her, and I meant it. I looked at her profile as she drove. the same route we'd taken 1,000 times, and I felt the weight of what was coming. The weight of knowing that in the next day or two, something was going to break. Something was going to force the truth out, and she was going to have to decide what to do with it. She said she'd made up the guest room. She said Landon was excited to see me. She said he'd been working on his approach all week, wanting to make sure he said things the right way, wanting to make sure we understood each other. I said that sounded fine. Landon was waiting at the house when we pulled up. He was standing on the front step like he'd been watching for the car. He greeted me at the door with a handshake and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile people use when they're performing politeness. He thanked me for my service again. Same words as always, same tone. He made a comment about how good it was that I could finally take some time off, how good it was that we could all be together. I set my bag down and followed them into the kitchen. My mom had made lunch, sandwiches and chips laid out on the counter, iced tea in a pitcher. She was trying to make it feel normal, casual, like this was just a regular visit. We sat at the table and talked about nothing for 20 minutes. The flight, the weather, base life, small talk that filled space without meaning anything. Then Landon shifted. I felt it before he spoke. The way he set his glass down just a little too deliberately, the way he leaned forward slightly, the way my mom went still. He said he'd been thinking about the storage unit. He said it had been on his mind a lot lately. He said it didn't make sense for me to be managing something from across the country when he was right there, when he could help, when he was part of the family now. He said it seemed like I was holding on to the past instead of letting my mom move forward. I asked him what he thought was in the unit. He paused. Just for a second. Then he said he didn't know, but that wasn't the point. The point was that it was creating tension. The point was that my mom deserved clarity. The point was that keeping secrets wasn't fair to anyone. I asked my mom if she wanted clarity, if she'd been lying awake at night wondering what was in a storage unit, if it had been weighing on her. She looked at me. Then she looked at Landon. Then she said she just wanted us to stop fighting about it. She said it had become this thing between us and she didn't understand why it had to be so complicated. I told her we weren't fighting. I told her Dad left specific instructions and I was following them. I told her if she wanted to see what was in the unit, I'd take her, but it was going to be just us, just the two of us. Landon's face changed. The smile dropped. He said that was exactly the kind of exclusion he was talking about. He said I was treating him like a stranger. He said it was insulting and unfair, and if I didn't trust him, then maybe I didn't trust my mom either. Maybe I thought she couldn't make her own decisions. Maybe I thought I was the only one who knew what was best. My mom flinched. I saw it. The way his words landed, I kept my voice level. I said trust wasn't the issue. Privacy was. And Dad had been clear about who should have access. He'd been clear about why. And I was going to honor that. Landon stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. He said he wasn't going to sit there and be accused of something. He said I was the one causing problems. He said I was manipulating my mom with some fantasy about what my dad would have wanted. He said my dad was gone and this was real life now and I needed to accept that. I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at my mom and asked if she believed that. She didn't answer. She sat there with her hands folded on the table, staring at the space between us, and the silence stretched out until it felt like its own answer. Landon left the room. I heard him go upstairs. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. A door closing. Not slamming, just closing with enough force to make a point. My mom sat at the table with her hands folded and stared at the floor. Her shoulders were tight. Her jaw was set. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile. I asked her if she was okay. She said she didn't know. She said everything used to be simple and now it felt complicated, and she didn't understand why I couldn't just let it go, why it had to be this hard, why I had to make it into something bigger than it needed to be. I told her I wasn't trying to make things harder. I told her I was protecting something Dad built, something he knew would matter, and when she was ready, I'd show her why. I'd show her everything. But not with Landon in the room, not with someone listening who had no right to hear it. She nodded. But I wasn't sure she heard me. I wasn't sure she was hearing anything except the tension and the weight of being caught between two people she cared about. I went to bed that night in the guest room and lay awake listening to the house settle. I could hear them talking in low voices down the hall. Couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the rhythm. His voice steady and insistent, hers quieter, uncertain, the sound of someone being convinced of something they didn't quite believe. I checked my phone. Eli had sent a message around 9. No activity at the facility. All quiet. I sent back a reply. Stay alert. He's planning something. This isn't over. Sunday morning, my mom made breakfast, eggs and toast. Coffee in the pot. The kitchen smelled normal. Comforting. Like nothing was wrong. Landon didn't come downstairs. She said he had a headache. She said he was stressed. She said it in that tone people use when they're making excuses but don't quite believe them themselves. I didn't push it. I ate and helped clean up and asked if she wanted to go for a walk. Get some air. Get out of the house for a bit. She said yes. I think she was relieved to have an excuse to leave. We walked through the neighborhood, past houses that looked the same as they had when I was a kid. Same trees, same driveways, same mailboxes at the curb. I waited for her to talk first. I let the silence be what it needed to be. She didn't say anything for 2 blocks, just walked, hands in her pockets, eyes forward. We looped back toward the house and she finally said she didn't know what to do. She said Landon made her feel safe, but I made her feel like she should be worried. She said she was tired of feeling like she had to choose, like every decision was taking a side, like there was no way to keep everyone happy. I told her she didn't have to choose. I told her I just needed her to wait a little longer, to trust that I wasn't doing this to hurt her, that I wasn't trying to control her life or sabotage her marriage. I was trying to protect her from something she couldn't see yet. She asked what I thought I was going to find. I told her the truth. I said I didn't need to find anything. I said the point was making sure Landon couldn't take anything that wasn't his, that the unit existed to make things clear, to make sure no one could rewrite the story after Dad was gone. She stopped walking. She turned to look at me. She said Dad never told her about any of that. She said if he'd been worried about something, he would have said something. I told her he did. He told me, and he wrote it down, and when she was ready, I'd show her. We went back inside. Landon was in the kitchen. He looked at me and then at my mom, and I could see him calculating, trying to read how the walk had gone, whether he'd lost ground or gained it. He said he thought it was time we cleared the air. He said this in a tone that was meant to sound reasonable, conciliatory, like he was extending an olive branch. He said he didn't want to fight. He said he loved my mom and he respected me and he just wanted us to be a family. A real family, not whatever fractured version we'd been playing at. I said that was fine. He said he still didn't understand why the storage unit was such a big deal. He said if there was nothing to hide, why not just open it up and settle it, show everyone what was inside, clear the air, move past it. He said it over and over, framing it like the solution was obvious and I was the one making it complicated. I said because Dad didn't ask me to settle it. He asked me to protect it. There's a difference. Landon's jaw tightened. The reasonable mask slipped for just a second. He said my dad was gone. He said my mom was here and she had a life now and I couldn't keep controlling things from a distance. I couldn't keep treating her like she was incapable of making decisions. I asked him what he thought he was being kept from. He didn't answer. He just looked at my mom and said something about how I didn't respect their marriage, how I'd never accepted him, how everything would be easier if I could just let go. My mom's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it and frowned, picked it up. Her face changed. She said it was Eli from the storage facility. She asked why he was calling her, why he even had her number. I told her to answer it. I kept my voice calm, steady. She did. She listened. I watched her face as she processed what she was hearing. The confusion, then the disbelief, then something sharper. She said Eli wanted to confirm that someone named Landon had tried to access the unit yesterday evening, that he claimed to be calling on her behalf, that he'd shown up at the facility and insisted he had permission, that Eli had refused and logged the attempt per my instructions. Landon said it was a misunderstanding, said it fast, defensive. He said he'd just been trying to help. He said Eli had overreacted. He said he'd only gone to check on it because my mom had been worried and he wanted to ease her mind. He said it wasn't what it sounded like. My mom asked me if it was true, if Landon had really tried to get into the unit. I said yes. I said Landon had tried to access the unit without permission. Again. For the second time, she went pale. She set the phone down carefully. She looked at Landon and asked him if it was true. Her voice was quiet, almost too quiet. He said I was twisting things. He said he'd never threatened anyone. He said I was making him sound dangerous when all he'd done was try to be helpful, when all he'd ever done was try to take care of her. I pulled out my phone. I opened the folder I'd been building for weeks, months. I showed her the dates, the messages, the exact phrasing he'd used, the timeline of isolation tactics and financial access and pressure disguised as concern. Every conversation logged, every shift documented, every pattern highlighted. She read it. She didn't say anything. She just scrolled through it, her finger moving down the screen, her expression getting tighter with each entry. Then she looked at him and asked him why. Just that. Why? He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, and I could see him trying to figure out which approach would work, which angle would let him recover. Then he said he'd just been trying to make sure she was taken care of, that I was too far away to know what she needed, that he'd only been doing what any husband would do, what any good partner would do. She asked him what he thought was in the unit. What had he been so desperate to see? He said he didn't know. He said it didn't matter. He said the point was that she deserved to know, that I'd kept her in the dark, and that wasn't fair. I asked him why he'd brought bolt cutters. The room went silent. He didn't have an answer for that. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at my mom like she might save him. She didn't. My mom stood up. She pushed back from the table and walked to the counter and braced herself against it with both hands. She was shaking. I could see it from across the room. Her whole body was tense, trembling. I told her we could go to the unit right now if she wanted. I told her I'd show her everything, every document, every piece of evidence, every reason Dad had built this system. But I told her it wasn't going to change what Landon had tried to do. It wasn't going to erase the bolt cutters or the lies or the pattern of control. She nodded. She took a breath. She said she wanted to see it. She wanted to understand what Dad had been protecting. But first she wanted Landon to leave. She wanted him out of the house. Landon started to argue. His voice rose. He said she was being manipulated. He said I'd been planning this for months. He said I'd poisoned her against him, that I'd set this whole thing up to make him look bad because I'd never accepted their marriage, because I couldn't let her be happy, because I needed her to stay stuck in the past. I kept my voice low and steady. I took a piece of paper out of my bag, unfolded it carefully, set it on the table in front of my mom. It was a letter my dad had written and left with the lawyer, sealed and dated, years before Landon even existed in our lives. It was addressed to my mom. It explained why the unit existed, why he'd set it up the way he had. It explained the trust documents he'd put in place to make sure she was protected if someone ever tried to claim ownership of things that weren't communal property, things that had been his alone, things meant for her protection, not for sharing. I told her she could read it. I told her Dad had anticipated this exact situation, not Landon specifically. He didn't know who it would be, but someone like him, someone who would show up after grief had softened the edges, someone who would try to rewrite the narrative and claim things that weren't theirs to claim. She picked up the letter. Her hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure she'd be able to read it, but she did. She read it twice, slowly. Then she set it down and looked at Landon. She said she wanted him out of the house, right now. He said she didn't mean that. He said she was upset and I'd confused her. He says she needed time to think this through. time to calm down, time to see that I was the problem, not him. She said no. Her voice was stronger now, clearer. She said she'd had plenty of time to think, too much time, and what she was thinking was that he'd lied to her, that he'd used her, that he'd tried to access something that wasn't his, that he'd blamed her daughter for protecting her when that's exactly what I'd been doing, protecting her. Just like Dad had asked me to. He tried one more time. He said she'd regret this. He said I'd turn her against everyone who cared about her. He said she'd end up alone. She told him to leave. I pulled out my phone. I called Eli. I told him we were coming to the facility and I needed him to forward the security footage from the bolt cutter incident to the email address I was about to send him. Landon froze. I set down a still image from that footage. It showed him at the unit, bolt cutters in hand, clear as day. My mom placed it on the table next to the letter. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him. The doorbell rang. Landon went stiff. I stood and walked to the front door. It was a police officer. Eli was standing behind him. The officer asked for Landon. He said he was following up on a report of attempted forced entry at a storage facility. Landon came into the hallway. He tried to make it sound casual. He said there'd been a misunderstanding. He said it was a family matter. Eli stepped forward. He said Landon had been unauthorized. He said they had video documentation. He said there'd been a clear attempt to breach a secured unit without the owner's consent. The officer asked Landon to step outside. My mom came up behind me. She told Landon to do what the officer said. Landon looked at me as he passed. He said this wasn't over. I didn't respond. I just watched him walk out the door. The officer handled it on the front step. Landon's voice got louder for a minute, then quieter. Then he was just standing there, listening, hands at his sides. When the officer came back in, he told us Landon had been informed that any further attempts to access the unit or contact my mom without her explicit permission would result in formal charges. He said Landon's car was already gone. He asked my mom if she was okay. She nodded. She thanked him. He left. Eli stayed for a minute. He asked if we needed anything else. I told him we'd be by the facility later that week. He said he'd make sure everything was ready. After he left, the house went quiet. My mom sat at the kitchen table. The documents were still spread out in front of her. She stared at them for a long time. She said she should have known. She said she'd ignored the small things because it felt easier than being alone. She said she'd let him take over because it felt like relief. I told her she didn't have anything to apologize for. I told her he was good at what he did, that he'd played it exactly the way people like him always do. She asked how long I'd been watching. I told her since the first question, since the moment he started counting things that didn't belong to him. She started crying. Not loud, just quiet tears while she sat there looking at the letter my dad had written years ago, anticipating a moment exactly like this. The next morning we sat at the same table. The light was different, softer. My mom looked tired, but clearer. She said she'd spent the night going through everything Landon had changed. Passwords, accounts, access to things he'd framed as helping with. I told her we could fix it. We spent the morning on the phone with the bank, changing passwords, freezing any access he'd set up for convenience. We called the lawyer. He outlined the next steps. Restraining order, formal notice, documentation of all the attempts. My mom asked if Landon would come back. I told her he might try, but he wouldn't get far now. She asked what the unit meant to me now. I told her it had always meant protection, not secrecy. Protection. She said she wanted to see it. She wanted to see what Dad had built. So we went together, just the two of us. Eli met us at the facility. He greeted my mom by name, gentle and professional, and stepped aside to give us space. I unlocked the outer lock, then the inner one. The door rolled up with a metallic scrape that echoed in the corridor. My mom stood at the threshold for a minute. Just stood there, looking into the unit at the careful rows of labeled boxes, at the filing cabinet in the back corner, at the order of everything. Then she stepped inside. She looked around slowly, taking it all in. At the labeled boxes with Dad's handwriting on the tape. At the filing cabinet that held the documents. At the careful precision of everything, the way it was all organized by category and date, the way nothing was random, the way everything had a purpose. She said, "Oh, this is him." Quiet. Almost to herself. "This is exactly him." I nodded. I knew what she meant. The labels, the system, the way everything had its place. Dad was in every detail of this space. We stood there in the dust and old paper smell, the fluorescent light humming overhead. She touched one of the label boxes and steadied herself against it. She ran her fingers over his handwriting, over the careful loops of his letters. I showed her the cabinet, the one in the back. I explained what was inside without opening it yet. Copies of documents, records, anything that could be twisted or claimed or rewritten, preserved exactly as it had been. Legal documents, financial records, property records, things that showed clear lines of ownership and intent. She said it wasn't dramatic at all. It wasn't some conspiracy or hidden fortune. It was just clarity, just consent on paper. Just Dad making sure that when he was gone, no one could rewrite the story of what belonged to who and why. We spent an hour sorting through the outer boxes. Books. Some of Dad's favorites that he'd wanted to keep safe. A coat she remembered him wearing. His winter coat with the torn pocket he'd never fixed. A cracked picture frame with a photo of the three of us from years ago. The glass spider-webbed, but the photo intact. She held each thing for a moment before setting it aside, like she was saying hello and goodbye at the same time. She said she didn't need to go through all of it right now. She said she just needed to know it was here, that it was protected, that Dad had thought ahead enough to build this, that he'd loved her enough to anticipate what might come and give her the tools to handle it. We locked it back up. Both locks. Eli walked us to the car. My mom thanked him, not just for today, for everything, for following the rules, for calling when Landon showed up, for being part of the system Dad had built to keep her safe. He said it was no trouble. That's what the system was for. That's why people put safeguards in place. That night, my mom made dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad. We ate quietly, with long stretches of silence that felt safe instead of tense, comfortable instead of heavy. She said she didn't want to rush into anything. She didn't want to replace one thing with another. She didn't want to fill the space Landon left with someone else just because the space was there. She just wanted to slow down and figure out what she actually wanted. What would make her happy? What would feel right instead of just easy? I told her that sounded right. That sounded healthy. The next day, I packed to head back to base. My mom stood at the door and watched me check my bag, make sure I had everything. She looked steadier than she had in months, still tired, still processing, but steadier. She thanked me. She said she hadn't understood at first why I'd been so careful, why I'd refused to just open the unit and show Landon, why I'd documented everything instead of just confronting him directly. She said now she understood. She said Dad had known. He'd known exactly what might happen, and he'd given me the tools to handle it without her having to choose sides until the proof was undeniable. I told her I was always going to protect her, even when it didn't make sense, even when she didn't see it yet, even when it meant being the difficult one, the rigid one, the one who wouldn't just let things be easy. She hugged me, held on longer than usual. Then she let me go. On the drive to the airport, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I glanced at it at a red light. The message said, "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. I didn't escalate. I didn't let the anger rise. I blocked the number, logged the message in the same folder with everything else, and kept driving. Because the win wasn't in shutting him down forever. It was in the boundaries. In the receipts, in the consequences that came from his own actions, not from me forcing them. It was in my mom having the clarity to choose differently next time, the tools to see the pattern before it went too far, And it was in me knowing I'd done what my dad had asked me to do. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without my mom going through pain and confusion and the hard work of untangling what had been wrapped around her, but carefully, with documentation and patience and faith that the truth would do its work if I gave it time. I'd protected what mattered. I'd kept the promise. I'd honored the system Dad had built. That's what the unit was always for. Not to hide things, not to create drama, not to control, but to protect. To make sure that when someone tried to rewrite the story, there was a clear record of what had actually happened, what had actually been intended, what actually belonged to who. The rest was up to her, and I trusted her to figure it out, to take her time, to rebuild without rushing, to choose with her eyes open instead of in the fog of grief and loneliness. That's all Dad had ever wanted. That's all I'd ever wanted. For her to have the choice, the real choice, the one that comes from clarity instead of manipulation.